This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
George, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Well, hello, Bob, and thanks for having me.
Sure thing. Glad that we could make this work out. So you have published a paper defending the use of the barter theory of money. So maybe just for the listeners, just take a big step back here and can you explain the big picture, like how you got interested in this topic?
Yes, I'm generally a monetary economist. That's what I studied when I was in graduate school. My PhD is in Bulgarian monetary aggregates. And I've been interested in the institutional side of money for a long time because I just happened to be at Washington University in St. Louis during the time when Doug North was there. And actually, for a couple of years, I was his research and teaching assistant. So I always tried to look on the institutional side of things, and especially of money. And then I started reading all these books. But basically, they have the same pattern. You thought you knew what money was, but it's not what you thought it was. I'm going to tell you what money is. And then they start everybody going in their own directions. And then the last 25 years, I started noticing that many people saying, but that's not how money came to be. The usual story, which we call the barter story of the economists, that there was barter, it's inconvenient, and people came up with all kinds of ways to work around that. One of them was the indirect exchange facilitated by money. There are also other ways. It's not the only one, but that's the origin. And then some anthropologists especially, but also some sociologists, also some financiers even, started saying, no. Money did not come about this way. There were other things. There was never barter. There was never markets. The usual Karl Polanyian story of never markets before the 19th century and so on. So I started to look more deeply into what their arguments were. Actually, I credit you personally because I followed your methodology related to your criticisms, especially of Krugman, in the Contra Krugman, both the podcast and the book, where you were actually clicking the links to check if everything is all right.
Right.
So I started clicking links and all kinds of stuff started coming up, which did not support the anti-barter story. So I started piling up material on that issue. And then about 10 years ago, I decided that I'm going to be working on, and it's taking a lot of time, but I'm still doing it, on a larger project called Theories of the Origins of Money. And this is sort of a first paper coming out of that, basically saying, we cannot exclude the barter story because it actually, in fact, has not been rejected. And the rejection is a mirage in the eyes of those that thought they achieved it. Sadly, one of the biggest proponents of the rejection of barter, David Graeber, passed away like 5 years ago. So he is not going to be able to defend his position further. But I think that in the paper, I make it pretty clear that the argument that the barter story has been rejected is unsustainable at this point.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is, thank you for the summary, and we'll just unpack that as we go through this interview here. Let me just take a few moments because I want to make sure the listener who might not be hip deep in these controversies understands why I think this is so relevant to an Austrian audience. That, for one thing, Karl Menger's theory of the origin of money is not just a niche Austrian element, but he actually wrote for the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, I believe is what it was. He, Karl Menger, they assigned him that entry, in terms of what with the origin of money. So the way he explains that is one of the leading examples of that story. But it's not just an Austrian perspective. Like you see versions of this story in Adam Smith even, right? So, and
Yes.
again, the for folks at home, like, so what I think George and I will be referring to as the barter story is just the idea that originally, people had property and they had what was called direct exchange, which was great. If you had mutually advantageous trades, then both parties walk away with higher subjectively valued items. But there's limitations to that. And then, as in Menger's telling, he said, oh, if you have a good that's relatively unmarketable or unsaleable and you want to get
your
something.
telescope.
Yes. Then you find somebody else that's got something that's more marketable. Even if that's not what you directly want, you might trade away your thing for that because I'm going to much more likely to find somebody who wants, these things. And then that process just snowballs. And so he can kind of explain step by step, even though nobody set out to, quote, invent money, it spontaneously emerges, right? So it's a very Austrian story. And then, as George says, last thing I'll say here, George, that there has just been a wave of criticisms of that in recent years and maybe even decades, such that like the fans of David Graeber just think that he demolished that theory with anthropological evidence, and that, oh, you economists with your armchair logic, you just refuse to look at empirical evidence. Whereas we've known for a long time now that this barter myth story, like that doesn't happen. And there's a famous quote from Graeber. This won't be the exact words, but he says something like, the standard economist story of barter, money, credit gets things exactly backwards. Historically, we know that it emerged the other way. The first was credit and then money and then barter, all right. So anyway, that's kind of the context. The last thing I'll say is, in terms of it, this isn't just a theoretical curiosity or historical investigation, but there are policy implications in the sense that, like the MMT people, for example, it's very important to them to say, no, the state creates money because that just like gives it more power. And like, oh, if it weren't for the state, we wouldn't even have money. So, imagine that, you people. And so they want to, it's important to them. And I'm not just attacking a straw man. Like, they go out of their way to say this repeatedly, that, it's not true. Yes. They think we're being ideological by saying, oh no, the private voluntary sector can create money. We don't need the state for that. And so they think that we're the ideologues. So anyway, that's why this is such a hotly contested area.
Yes, and the thing is that this is one of the cases where I believe that theory informs history rather than the vice versa, especially the fact that Mises, in his theory of money and credit, came up with then it was the first Misesian theorem, the regression theorem, which is the only existing, no other exists, explanation of the value of money. Nobody has offered any other theory of why money has value and explained how this value gets formed, but the Mises regression theorem, and it has to have whatever happened to become money to be a marketable good in the beginning. Otherwise, we cannot explain money. So until somebody else comes with a different theory about the value of money, this one has to stand. It's like the Sherlock Holmes thing that regardless of how incredible, how impossible, if it's the only one standing, that's the explanation. So the Misesian regression theorem and his theory of money and credit actually, in my mind, proves that historically that there must have been some trading involved for money to emerge. It was not simply these debt relations that Graeber favors, or especially the state coming up all of a sudden much later, because the earliest possible emergence of the state as a player involves writing, and money is probably older than writing. So in that respect, respecting the Misesian contribution for what it is, it's the only standing theory of the value of money. No one can do anything about that. Nobody has done anything else. It means that history must have evolved somehow so that this theorem holds. And the Barter story, as originally told, actually the first person recorded who has told the Barter story is Aristotle. He's not the most pro-market guy on earth, as we know very well, but he told the story very explicitly in over 2 pages in his Politics. And then later the story was repeated, and especially Adam Smith. And then Karl Menger's exposition is actually excellent, the long one, the encyclopedia entry, which is in the tens of pages long. It is really a story of how an institution, a specific setting of social relations, emerges. And if in one thing Karol Polanyi may be a little bit correct, is that it is as complex a phenomenon as languages. It doesn't just come up, somebody snaps their fingers and it appears. So that's my impetus there. And the more I looked into the arguments against the Barter story, the weaker I found them. And actually, this paper is, look, guys, there is a case against the Barter story. It doesn't hold. A more detailed examination.
Okay, and that's why you were making the reference to like for people who didn't understand the sort of joke you did there.
Yes.
Folks, let me just explain it, George. So Tom Woods and I, as many of you probably remember, had a podcast called Contra Krugman, where we would weekly, take an op-ed or something that Krugman had done, a blog post he'd done, and then we'd go through it. And so what became a running joke was a lot of times Krugman would assert something and have a hyperlink, presumably backing up or justifying his claim. And I just got in the habit that I would click the link, and many times it would say the exact opposite of what Krugman was claiming. And so that became a running joke, like, oh yeah, I clicked the links, Tom. And then, Tom would, so that's what George is saying here. How should we proceed? Do you mind if I just read this Karol Polanyi quote? And maybe just have you react, because this is something that was not fully...
Yeah, this is one of the juicier stories, yes.
Okay, so again, and then, we can take this whatever direction you want, but again, this is, so folks, he's got, this long paper with all sorts of quotes and things. Obviously, we're just going to try to give you a sampling of it. So, Karol Polanyi wrote in 1944, referring to the 19th century, that previously to our time, no economy ever existed that, even in principle, was controlled by markets. Though the institution of the market was fairly common since the later Stone Age, its role was no more than incidental to economic life. And so I don't know if you have much you want to comment, but can you just explain, like, is that pervasive in this anti-barter story literature that they're saying,
yes,
you economists?
The anti-barter.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The larger context of anti-barter, and again, we're going to get to Mises, is the fight against economics as the most highly developed social science, explaining social phenomena that are very complex. And for things like Marxism to be capable of having anything to do with the reality and the truth of human existence, economics is in the way, so they have to get rid of it. And that, in his Human Action, Mises points of such attempts to get rid of economics because it's in the way of other ideologies. And then Graeber also eventually, shortly before he died, he actually started expressing the exact same sentiments. Economics should be done. It should be buried. Nobody should ever hear about economics. It's an exploitation tool of the ruling class and so on. So economics is in the way of a lot of those leftist, collectivist, against the market sentiments that we know very well about, sadly. And that's the bigger context. And Karol Polanyi is one of the big exponents. He was a Marxist. Big exponents of that type of research agenda in the, let's say, 1940s and 50s especially. And that's from his Great Transformation, is the quote, which basically said that somewhere in the 19th century, all of a sudden some exploiting classes discovered markets as a tool of exploiting the working class and started applying them everywhere. Before that, humankind did not know markets at all. That's basically his theory. It doesn't hold water. I mean, I can refer you, it's a different literature, but Deidre McCloskey has excellent refutations of all those Polanyian expositions. But on some points, for example, the close relation between, let's say, the money phenomenon and the language phenomenon, he has some not bad points. He was an extremely well-read and clever person, actually, as well as his brother, but he's less famous. So that's the start. And then the tradition continues with some of the students of Karol Polanyi against the market, especially George Dalton. And later it somehow turns into, oh, it's already been proven. It somehow is taken for granted by all the anthropologists, almost all, not all of them. There is this, I think her name is Mary Anderson or something like that, who is not really in that type of thinking. Many sociologists, they think it has been proven that things are, this capitalism thing is so very recent, people never knew more, even though, of course, Karol Polanyi cannot deny that people were exchanging things on markets, but he's trying to claim it's extremely marginal. Well, if you read Aristotle, not true. Actually, he's describing precisely market types of exchanges by peers based on their excess production of different goods. And it is so natural that money may have emerged from such things that Aristotle actually describes as from a first-person perspective. He actually lived those things. He is a witness. In the 4th century BC, that it's difficult to imagine that the story has been refuted.
So can I, and this is what it was fascinating. So as you just said there, George, like part of what you do here is you sort of, you go through and quote and kind of show how all these anthropologists seem to be just like talking in a circle, like all just agreeing with each other. Yes. And then they had convinced themselves like, yeah, everybody knows that the Barter story has been definitively rejected. And then you just were sort of saying, well, show me, like, don't just say it. And so one thing in particular that, let me just try to summarize, and obviously, tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but is that David Graeber, for example, says a definitive study on, the barter origins or whatnot is from this guy Humphrey. And if we go and look at that, we see that it's actually, there was a previously monetary economy, and then these various things happened, and they demonetized and like regressed into a barter. Well, regress is not the right word. Turned into barter. And so that's where Graeber's getting this notion that actually historically it goes, credit, money, then barter sometimes. But as you point out, like that's a weird logical argument to say there was never an original state of barter because this one particular case study.
This one particular tribe, went through this in the 20th century. Actually, it's a lady, Caroline Humphrey. I think she was in Oxford. But what Graeber calls the definitive study of the definitive anthropological work on barter, well, it involves one single population of a very smallish human tribe in the Himalayas, somewhere in where today is Nepal, which, because the border between China and India became very hard during the Cold War, all kinds of traffic stopped going through this territory, and the whole monetary establishment was dependent on this traffic. And when the traffic stopped, they demonetized and started bartering. And she basically says, well, you can have a previously monetized tribe that now has resorted to barter. That's all she says. Actually, this is not in any shape, way, or form a definitive study on the anthropology of barter. It studies only one population, and I quote some books published in the late 40s, 1940s. One has a second edition in the 1960s, where it's in the hundreds of what they call primitive money. That's Quiggin and Einzig. Societies with monetary arrangements that have been described, they call them primitive. Probably today this word would not be very well accepted. And there are hundreds. She has not studied the hundreds. She has studied one So that cannot constitute a definitive work on the anthropology of barter under any definition of the definitive work. And then she herself bases her claim because she begins. Actually, it's her starting assumption. It's not her final finding.
Mm-hmm.
It's her starting assumption is, if we reject the barter story, can we still find barter?
Yeah.
And she says, yes, we found it in this one tribe in the Himalayas. But she has not proven that there was no barter. And she has only one quotation, only one reference, and it's to a work by a Dutch sort of monetary but also anthropological author, Thomas Krump, who has a large book, The Phenomenon of Money, very interesting book. And there he does not say there was never money, there was never barter, there was never barter exchange. He just says it was not very common, and it was not very likely for money to emerge from such arrangements by humans. But it's not very likely within the light of his very formal mathematical complex neoclassical type of model. Otherwise, it's not quite so unlikely in the messy reality that we live in. So actually, Thomas Krump would disagree that there was never significantly large barter exchange so that it could generate the monetary phenomenon. He just says it's not very likely. In history, we don't find many instances. He actually quotes 3. In the literature, I have found several more. One of them is actually Mesopotamia, where we know probably the monetary phenomenon first came to be. So when you click the links and you actually read through the reference, it does not really say what Graeber implies it says.
Mm-hmm. Can I, going along with that, just you had mentioned, just to return to Humphreys for a minute, is because I really liked what you did there, or in the paper, is let me just read this and maybe just explain for the listeners too, because it gets really subtle and nuanced, and some people might think, oh, come on, what's the difference? But it's critical, like you say, in terms of explaining, like, well, wait a minute, this idea that they're all just kind of patting themselves on the back, like, yeah, we rejected the bar. So you're saying, so folks, this is a direct quote from his paper. Going further, Humphrey does justify her assumption rather than conclusion that barter did not precede money with the following statement, quote, "We know from the accumulated evidence of ethnography that barter was indeed very rare as a symptom dominating primitive economies." And then the references to a single source of Krump and so on. And so what's funny though, is you go on to say, but yet on the first page of her study, Humphreys had stated, no example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described. All available ethnography suggests there has never been such a thing. And so
Yes.
Georgy in his paper, makes the important point that, well, wait a minute, there, she's just flatly saying on page 1, no example exists. It's never been described. And then later she actually says it was very rare. Yes. And so just, I don't know if you're going to like this analogy, Georgy, but imagine if you're, talking to researchers about the origin of life, and you say, in general, if you just had, a pond out there with lifeless molecules, would you expect a cell to emerge? And they would say, oh no, that would be incredibly unlikely. And so therefore, would you say, so that proved that, there
no
was
life.
Biblical Genesis, not getting into a religious argument, but my point is people would say, no, all you would need is it happened once, and then that could explain the origin. So likewise here, the fact that we don't have I have other points too, but is that a fair way of me assessing what you did there and showing how she went from saying it's rare to it doesn't exist, we have no evidence whatsoever? Like, that's different from saying it's rare.
And your reference to the beginnings of life would sound familiar to lots of your listeners because you've discussed this topic at length. Yes, the fact that it's not very likely does not mean it did not happen exactly that way. So very many unlikely things have happened in the universe history, in the Earth history, in human history, that one more would not be a surprise to anybody. Unlikely thing to have actually happened. So the argument it's unlikely is qualitatively different from the argument it never happened. And that's what Humphrey is doing on page 1. She says, never observed. All the evidence points against that. And then on the second page, she says, when she actually has to refer to a source, she says rare and unlikely. But these are two extremely different propositions, whether it's impossible or possible, but low probability. Because it enters the conversation in a different mode. If we say, yes, it's not very likely, but obviously if we have no other explanation other than the regression theorem for the value of money, that must be it. Yes, may have been unlikely, but we don't have other story. Nobody else has proposed another story. Of course, the MMTers would tell you it was the state, but their story would not hold up and you've done excellent job on it, and your recent conversations with Jonathan Newman were informative on that actually even that story does not hold when you check the evidence, which Jonathan is doing right now. I'm expecting this to be published soon. All the MMTers, and especially the historical origin and the state origin of money, it does not hold because it requires writing, and also, and I believe money is older than writing, and also it requires silver. And somehow the wise government coming up with silver exactly at the same time when everybody else was coming up with silver sounds even less likely. Many other theories of the origins of money do not hold. There is also the temple theory, the palatial theories, the credit theory of Graeber. He is not such a big fan of government origins. He's a little bit of anarchist, left-leaning anarchist, but his that story, and that's my bigger project, trying to see how each of those holds up against first the theory, and then against the historical evidence. It seems like the Barter story looks the best so far.
Great. Maybe this is the appropriate time too. That I think what's happening is there's so much don't want it to be the case that they're not honestly saying, suppose the Barter story were true, what would the historical or anthropological evidence look like? Because again, suppose it were true and that it did, there's very, long ago, there was primitive societies and they were using barter. And then if money emerged in one place, it would rapidly spread throughout. And so it's not necessarily the case that you would find, evidence of 16 separate, independent city states from thousands of years ago that all relied on barter. And I was making the point, to Jonathan and others when we talk about this stuff, is that in the Mengerian story, especially, because I think that's the best, theoretical example or exposition of the logic. It's if you started out in a state of pure, we're saying barter, but really be like direct exchange in terms of like a Misesian, framework, that it's not like you would expect that to persist for 7 generations. And then finally, 300 years down the road, somebody might say, I had this relatively unsaleable commodity. Maybe I should. No, it's something that would happen like the next time someone tried to sell something. You would expect, you know what I mean? So
it's so rational and logical that probably the moment people started actually having surpluses to exchange with each other, or not so much people, but probably larger groups, tribes, and then households within tribes, they would, within one generation, come up with the marketable good flowing around.
Right. I was thinking like the only reason a priori you would expect that it wouldn't is if you just had like nomadic traders who never thought they were going to see each other again. Then maybe there it would just be spot direct exchanges. But hey, for all I know, I'm never going to see this guy again. So maybe. And
there have been these silent negotiations. There have been examples, very interesting sort of approaches to this trade by unknown tribes. But again, nobody's saying barter was the only game in town. What money origin needs is just to have some barter. You may exchange in other modes. You may actually have debt based exchanges. That does not prevent in any way the barter story to be true. You just need to have some barter, and then the most marketable good, the most saleable, as Menger says, would eventually win over and become the money, this single sort of generally accepted medium of exchange, and which is the Mengerian definition and Misesian of money. And then, obviously, the best forms of such generally accepted thing, which turns out to be precious metals, would eventually emerge in places where the supply and demand of these precious metals is sufficiently convenient. Obviously, a lot of circumstances need to fall in place, but they obviously did. Not the first time, like you said, with life. So many things had to fall in place for life to emerge. It did.
So let me, just because you alluded to it there, go off on a somewhat of a tangent here, because that was the one element of Graeber's analysis, the intertemporal, credit transactions, or we would call them, that I realized, oh yes, like when I would teach the origin of money to undergrad classes and I would walk through and just look at how airtight this is, that I had completely overlooked the possibility of, people giving up present goods right now in exchange for, hey, down the road, you're going to give me something to reciprocate. And that is, a complication, certainly. And you would imagine, especially like in primitive societies where people are just all kind of living in a tribe or something, that would clearly come, somebody has a good harvest, they share it with their neighbors, knowing that, oh, they're going to return the favor. And you can imagine that not even necessarily being like a market transaction, but just sort of custom that is advantageous to the survival of the group. And so that's why, okay, I'm like, I can do that. But like you said, the problem with Graeber's story, where again, he tries to say, oh, first there was credit, then money, and then occasionally barter, and Graeber admits it to his credit. He said, yeah, like, if I help my neighbor by, him fixing his house, and now he owes me that, and then down the road, I'm hungry and he has extra pigs. And so, but you need to know what's the exchange ratio between fixing a house and getting some pigs. And how would you know? Oh, if you had barter, then you would know. But
you immediately have the market price. Yes. The exchange ratio is a very important aspect. Everybody seems to forget. Yes, everybody says double coincidence of wants. People need to be in the same place to actually trade. It's a spot trade and so on. But actually, they have to agree on the price. Everybody seems to be forgetting that. If they don't agree on the price, no matter how monetary the economy is, we're not going to get a transaction. And how do they agree on a price? Well, it may be a one-time thing, which obviously did exist, and the gift exchanges of older times of Marcel Mauss and so on, obviously they happened probably in history. But that does not prevent the barter place of the origin of money in any way, shape, or form. People were exchanging in all kinds of modes. The barter story does not say they did not exchange using debt relations. They did not exchange using gift exchange. They did not exchange using, actually, there's very interesting history of blood money and bride money and so on. Yes, all of them. But the only place where you can get a price and something becoming the most saleable thing is a more regular type of trade, a market type of trade, which is the barter story.
Yep, great. So again, just to emphasize, folks, that the earlier point is if anthropologists went out and they did discover some community that had been in a state of pure barter for 8 generations, as long as anyone could remember, that would actually be a problem for the Mengerian story.
Yes.
You would say, why did they persist in this state when the whole point of his story is to explain how natural and spontaneous it would be for a medium of exchange to emerge that outstripped all the other, So ironically, like, again, that's what I meant when I was saying they're kind of unfairly holding up, like, say, well, if your theory were true, we would see this. And it's like, no, actually, we would see the opposite, And then on this point too, so I liked your paper that you were nuanced, and your point was not to say that, yes, it must have been that in the past, everybody was just doing pure barter and nothing else. That, these other things could have been going on, and we certainly should look at the evidence and not just from our armchair, just try to deduce what history must have been. But like you say, there's logical problems to try to go from just a debt-based set of relationships to the emergence of money, that how do you know what one thing trades for against another unless people are trading it against it? You know what I mean? That's what we mean by barter.
Exactly. To be fair to Graeber, he does say that. Yeah, I owe you one, but one what? At one point,
Right.
he does admit that. And also he admits that there were obviously barter exchanges. He insists, however, that for the origin of money, something that they call the barter economy is necessary. Like everything is barter. Almost nothing gets traded in other ways. Everybody is using barter. No, the Barter story does not, especially the original Barter story. If you try to do a neoclassical general equilibrium story, Barter story, then probably you would need that, but not in the Aristotelian, Smithian story, Mengerian especially. You don't need that. You just need some people to have been involved in barter.
Yes.
Yep. Alongside everything else.
Right. And then also too, the other thing I wanted to just pull out of what you said there is like the silver shekels and stuff, and kind of going with what Jonathan Newman was saying. And this is when I first reviewed Graeber's book. What was it? Debt, the First 5,000 Years, I think was the title of it. As I went through it, I just focused on, this issue about him allegedly slam dunk destroying the barter origin of money, is that the examples he was giving, I don't remember if it was like ancient Phoenicia or something, to show like, oh no, it was like a temple tax or blah, blah, blah. And what they were using was the shekel of silver. And that was their monetary. And it was like, that seems like a big coincidence that you guys are just saying, no, it was just from the powerful, like religious or government officials by edict, just declaring this thing is the money. And they happen to pick the thing that on a Mengerian framework, we can totally explain why that is what they would have chosen, So anyway, it just, again, like you're saying, it's the historical evidence that they were pointing to is entirely consistent with the Mengerian story. It's just, they're so sure that's wrong that they can't see it.
Also, another thing about the debt story is that debt requires, especially if it's going to become at some point tradable debt, so that it may serve as a beginning of money. Graeber, by the way, never finishes the story of exactly how money emerged from old debt relations. It has to be recorded somehow, so you need writing. Mm-hmm. And I continue saying that human exchanges, and therefore the inconveniences of barter, and therefore coming up with some solutions around barter, one of which is indirect exchange, serviced by the most saleable thing, are much older than writing. And another point of my story is they say, oh, no archaeological evidence. And my question is, what do you need to see in archaeological evidence to say, aha, this was exchanged using barter? Because what you see in archaeology, some bones from here, which have been transferred there, some obsidian from a faraway source traveling some 1,000 miles, but you don't know how it was exchanged. Mm-hmm. Saying, I have seen no evidence of barter, puts the question, what evidence do you need to see? And I cannot imagine what would archaeologists see in the record to say, aha, that was done by barter. You have the hair bones here, and you have the pheasant bones there. How do you know how they were exchanged?
Right. Very good. Yes. That's actually, it's funny. That's such an obvious, like that's a good application of the principle I've said twice now in this episode, but you're right. Just saying it like that succinctly is just hit me, like a 2x4 on the head, that, cause you're right. It's clear cut once money does emerge and there's records like of financial transactions. It's clear how we can find those and say, oh, this merchant's keeping track of, selling all the sheep or whatever. So that makes sense. But you're right. If it were a situation where there was no common unit of exchange and it was just people trading things, in kind or whatever,
nobody would record anything.
Yeah. What would you even write down except like just a document that, why would you do that? They would. So yeah, very, very good that the evidence they would have seen, that might not even be perceived as a financial record. It wouldn't be obvious what they were even saying. So
to me, the argument there's no archaeological evidence. There is a well-known saying in those type of circles, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we do not have evidence of barter does not mean there was no barter, because what evidence do you want to see?
Yes. You did. So if I could change gears here, and you mentioned it a second ago, that's something I did want to ask you to elaborate on. So here's just a quick quotation from you, George. You say, in this theoretical aspect, the rejection of the barter story is based on a conflation of the original barter story with neoclassical economics. It is true that the barter story is very easy to incorporate in the framework built by neoclassical economics, and it may be argued that it has indeed been so incorporated through the decades, but that does not mean in any way that the barter story depends on the assumptions of neoclassical economics. So can you just explain there, what happened, and then why you think they're attacking, a more modern form that's actually weaker?
Actually, as a fan of Austrian economics, I'm not a big fan of neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics, when I use this term, is the marriage of the marginal analysis with the higher math. And especially the insistence on equilibria, especially the general equilibrium. And we can see how the barter story, by being based on market exchanges, very conveniently enters this type of narrative, which is the neoclassical one. Even though neoclassical economics cannot explain money, they have absolutely no story. They have to force the money into the models. And one of the things I studied in the 90s was exactly that, how either you have to put them in the budget constraint, like the well-known Klauer constraint, or you have to put them in the utility function, which is Miguel-Sidrowski, or you have to force somehow money in the model for it to be present. It does not emerge from the neoclassical models. That's one of the reasons why neoclassicists need to rethink everything they do. If you cannot explain money, your theory is not worth much. And money as a social phenomenon, a societal relation, very complex. But the barter story does not need general equilibrium, does not need higher math, does not need Homo economicus, which Graeber annihilates, and one would agree with Graeber on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Homo economicus is a useless ideal type or an imaginary construct. It does not help. Actually be detrimental for our understanding of human societies. Destroying Homo economicus is not a bad thing in itself, but the barter story does not require such a being at all. Actually, Menger really describes living people like any other anthropologist would describe them, with all of their problems and imperfections and vices and so on. Does not prevent the barter story from being true in any way, shape, or form, the way it was told by Aristotle, Smith, and Menger.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote on that. When I was in grad school at NYU, it was called a paper writing seminar. We had to do it was like the point of the seminar was to teach you how to write a journal article, and so you had to have a topic. And I was searching around for something, and I thought, oh, you know what? I'm going to write about the origin of money, in a Mengerian sense, and model that because like you're saying, it was obvious once you start studying those formal neoclassical models that the money doesn't play. There's no reason to have money in those models. That everybody's just general equilibrium, a Walrasian economy, and everything, and you just have your consumption set and whatever. The price vector,
perfect information and everything.
So there's no reason to have money, but yet if it's a model that has a central bank, there's got to be money because the central bank has to do something. And so they just kind of force people to get utility from it, like holding a Picasso. So you just like holding money, because or something. So anyway, I thought, okay, surely in this literature, nobody has ever gone and read Menger and modeled that. And so I built up a formal model, whatever. And I went through and I presented at this seminar, and this old Boyan Jovanovic, who was like an eclectic guy that he read other stuff.
Yeah.
And he went, that's Keo Toko and Wright, 91. Exactly. And I went, what? So it was embarrassing that I didn't bother to do a thorough literature search because I just assumed, oh yeah, these crazy, but actually, and they actually cited Menger too. So anyway, it was, they had, paid homage to him and then did a formal search theoretical model, blah, blah, blah. So that does exist in the literature, but yet certainly the standard models that we learn.
Oh yes, there are search theoretical models of money, but they have the problem of explaining the value of money. The only person who has ever escaped the infinite circling loop is Mises with the regression theorem. Nobody has done that.
Yes,
nobody else.
Agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Just as we're wrapping up here, is there any major point? I went through and I was kind of asking you to elaborate on the nuggets that I found particularly interesting. Am I missing anything big from your paper that you feel, if we're summarizing it, we got to explain to the folks?
Well, probably as a last sort of short anecdote is the thing that I discovered when I actually pulled up Aristotle in Greek and discovered that Karol Polanyi was not really correctly quoting terms in Latin from Aristotle. And what Aristotle was saying was precisely the barter story. And he was using the correct word for barter. And Polanyi was sort of not very correct in his usage of what Aristotle said. So almost everywhere I clicked, I found that the actual evidence supports, at least adamantly does not reject the barter story. It is there all the time. It is quite possible, quite realistic. And that's probably what happened because, again, we do not have any other coherent story. All other stories need to rely on some miracle, all of a sudden money coming up with its value and started operating. No, the value had to come from somewhere.
Yeah, and just to make sure the folks are getting that, and that's why you keep alluding to the regression theorem. So the idea, folks, is, okay, suppose there, some ancient civilization that they're just using debt relations and things, and then some wise ruler perceives the benefits of using a commonly accepted medium of exchange. So for one thing, as Menger points out, that would be a genius. Like, how would you, money's kind of weird. Like, until you see it and think about it, it's not obvious why that even makes any sense. But okay. And so they hold up some shells and say, this is going to be the money now. This is going to be commonly accepted. If you want to sell horses, you want to trade horses for chickens, first trade your horses for these shells that you don't really want. But the person who's just trading chickens will do it too. And then it says, okay, well, how many shells does a horse trade for? I don't know. And so that's part of the issue. Like, to just de novo create money, you don't know what its purchasing power is. Whereas, Mises'
how did they know how many shekels daily wages to the workers, which you find in the tablets all the time? But how did they know how many shekels? So the question of how much cannot be answered by anything but the regression theorem.
Great. One last thing. Can you just explain, when you were saying Polanyi was mistakenly attributing views to Aristotle, was it because the translation from the Greek to the Latin was incorrect and Polanyi was just relying on a faulty translation?
I think he was just reading a Latin translation and he was wishfully thinking that the word that he was coming up with, which is metadosis, was used by Aristotle to name barter, and metadosis really does not mean barter. But actually, the word that Aristotle used for barter, he meant something completely else by the word metadosis, which is interchanges, and that's actually not the best word, but correct translation of the term. He used another word 4 times in the same paragraph to designate barter, and that was the word allagi. And Polanyi actually, and allagi means exchange. So Polanyi ignored that completely. So whatever he had to say about Aristotle's story is incorrect. Aristotle told a different story.
Okay, great. So is it fair to say in conclusion that when certain critics say that the barter story of the origin of money has been utterly rejected, if you go through and follow the citations to say, okay, show me why, there's no smoking gun anywhere, and then we have all these other largely theoretical reasons to say the barter story seems to be necessary, like to explain the value, and so all things considered,
Exactly.
that still seems like the best contender. Yeah.
No smoking gun has killed the Barter story, actually. When you click all the links and read through the stuff, they make it less likely than we probably thought, but still there. And again, no other explanation of the value of money exists but the regression theorem, which depends on exchanges taking place.
Oh, one last thing that I like to bring up a lot is we do have sort of a laboratory experiment to see the Barter story play out.
Radford,
with the PO,
yes.
Yeah, the Radford's, the economics of a POW, which folks, even if you don't care about so much the anthropology, I would encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're that kind of person, you probably should go read that article. It's very accessible. It's the guy's name's Radford, the economics of a POW camp.
Yes.
He was a trained economist who I think was in the Royal Air Force and was shot down.
He was British. I'm not sure whether he was in Europe or in the Pacific in a camp the whole war, and he describes the economic life of the camp and the emergence of money in the form of cigarettes.
Right. And what I love too, just last, is he clarified and said, well, now what we meant by that was the tobacco in a full-bodied cigarette, because otherwise, people could just tap out some of the tobacco and pass it off as one cigarette. So anyway, it's just great in terms of that was their money, folks, and clearly, it wasn't that someone
and
just got in charge.
Non-smokers were using it and accepting it, and smokers literally burned their money.
Yep. Okay, well, folks, my guest has been Georgy Ganev. The paper is on, let me see if I can scroll up, because I had gone down to the bottom of your citation. Let me get the exact quote. Has the barter theory of the origins of money been rejected? And we'll put links, of course, to the actual publication. So, George, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Bob, and I wish you all the best.
Same to you. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.